Thank you all for being here. I know it's a busy start to the semester. Thank you, Ernesto, for the invitation, and to Bill for helping organize it. Like Ernesto said, I'm new to Cornell, so it's cool to have the opportunity to share some of my work in progress with you. So I'm a scholar of Mexican and Central American cinema, and a lot of my work has focused on how cinema has been used in Latin America to visualize environmental harm or amplify activist efforts around things like land defense, as well as to contextualize environmental crisis and translate it into the visual medium of cinema. My work on Latin American eco-cinema, which we might call cinema with an environmentalist bent, I recently published a volume, who's a professor at Rice University, on how Latin American cinema helps represent environmental crisis. But in today's talk, I want to sort of talk you through some questions that have emerged for me as my research has evolved out of this project. Namely, after publishing this volume, I've become increasingly interested in how we can study cinema not just as a medium that represents environmental crisis, but as a cultural form that itself is enmeshed in materiality and nature at every stage of its production, from its conceptualization to its distribution. So here I'm following what's been called the material turn in media studies. That's been developed by scholars like Juicy Parica, who's on the far left there, who uses the word media natures to problematize the idea that media and nature are two separate things. Rather, by combining media and nature into one word, Parica underscores that thinking with nature, rather than just about nature, helps us better understand media as a whole. The two are inextricable. Media is made possible by nature. It requires a huge amount of natural resources, and it leaves in its wake long-lasting material legacies like emissions and electronic and material waste. I agree with Parica that thinking about the materialities of cultural practice can complement and complicate existing approaches that focus on cinematic representation. So my focus on the materialities of Mexican cinema are also informed by industry studies, represented by the middle book here, it's kind of blurry, by scholars like Tamara Falakov, who explains that cinema is not just an art form, it's also an industry, right? And studying cinema as an industry helps us think about its commercial imperatives, its funding structures, its methods of production, and its methods of distribution. So I think by combining these two approaches, we can begin to think materially about Mexican cinema, both in an eco-critical sense, but also in the Marxist sense, to think about cinema's organizational and spatial force, as well as how it might be reimagined, right, for like the 21st century. What do we want cinema to do in the future? The fact that the minerals and other raw materials that have made cinema possible have been largely sourced from the global south makes the analytic of materiality particularly relevant for scholars of Latin American cinema. And here I follow Cajetan Ijeca's book, African Eco-Media, where he observes that in Africa, the promise of media as a mechanism of cultural expression and critique, as a connector of people and cultures, and as a sign of modernity, coexists along with the devastating realities of its ecological costs and consequences. Right? The materials that make Hollywood possible are mined from Africa and Latin America. The refuse, the waste that's produced by things like smartphones also ends up in Africa and Latin America, right? So there's this coexistence of the possibilities and the problems of media that we can think about through the global south. The tension between the affordances and the shortcomings of media, Ijeca posits, is central to rethinking ethical living and media production in a time of finite resources. The same is true in Latin America, where cinema has diversified and proliferated as the technologies of filmmaking and film watching have become more portable, more affordable, opening the field to historically marginalized filmmakers and allowing viewers to engage with content that's been sidelined by the mainstream media. At the same time, the proliferation of devices devised around planned obsolescence, like smartphones, laptops, flat-screen TVs, is another key thread in the story of Latin American cinema that is often less thought about or talked about. So today I'm interested in sort of opening this conversation about what's the organizational force wielded by cultural infrastructure in Mexico, and how it's being reimagined on the ground for this sort of ethical living in the age of finite resources, or the age of climate crisis. So today, in my talk, I'm going to give you sort of an abbreviated materialist sketch of cinema in Mexico. I'll talk about the intersections of cultural infrastructure and the infrastructures of oil. And then I'll talk a little bit about access to cinema, which is one of the biggest problems in Mexican cinema today. And ask what's gained and what's lost when cinema becomes increasingly atomized. By that, I mean an individual experience, streaming rather than collective experience in the theater. And then I'll look at an example that models how the industry is beginning to be reimagined through post-carbon cinema initiatives. So I thought I'd start by talking briefly about a web series that emerged in the summer of 2021. Called El Tema, or the topic, the issue, organized around the tagline El Tema es el Clima. This series is available for free on YouTube. It's a really great pedagogical resource. Created by movie star and producer Gael Garcia Bernal in collaboration with Pablo Montaño Beckman, the series makes the case that climate change is the issue that Mexico faces in the 21st century. Each of its 6 10-minute episodes is oriented around a specific topic and place, from water in Chihuahua to energy in Tabasco. In each installment, Garcia Bernal and his co-host, Mije public intellectual Yasnaya Elena Aguilar Gil, guide viewers through the issues, speaking on the ground with activists, scientists, and citizens. The series mobilizes Garcia Bernal's star power to make the case that environmental crisis has not yet received enough mainstream attention in Mexico, while at the same time highlighting the efforts of those who are already advocating for better presents and futures for their communities. The 4th episode of El Tema Energía focuses on the state of Tabasco, home to numerous oil fields and the controversial Dos Bocas mega refinery, which is currently under construction, managed by the state-owned oil company Pemex, or Petróleos Mexicanos. The episode narrates how Pemex has transformed the region into a sacrifice zone, which has endangered mangrove forests, polluted waterways, and jeopardized fishing. A title card explains that climate change compounds this vulnerability. Sea level rise threatens to flood nearly a quarter of the state over the next 30 years, including the site of the Dos Bocas refinery, which is currently being built. This juxtaposition underscores the impasse between short-term investment in energy infrastructure and the territory's long-term future, which is jeopardized by the very emissions that this sort of infrastructure makes possible. It suggests that ongoing investment in oil infrastructure in Mexico continues despite its projected obsolescence. So if infrastructure gives material form to our dreams for the future, the Dos Bocas refinery's predicted flooding by sea level rise signals that current investment in fossil fuel infrastructure serves not the future, but the myopic demands of capital and its short-term profit horizons. The episode highlights local efforts to combat regional foreclosure, including the restoration of mangrove swamps, which are a key regulator of flooding, and advocacy for alternative forms of energy production. As host Yasnaya Elena Aguilar Gil explains, esas energías limpias pueden estar gestionadas de otra manera que no sea el capital o el Estado, but through small-scale communal efforts that apuestan por la vida, that bet on life rather than death. The episode calls on the audience to join in this collective task of post-carbon imagining and conjure up forms of infrastructure to sustain life in coastal Tabasco. El Tema illustrates then my point about how cinema can shed light on the socio-environmental toll of extractivism and how it can amplify activist calls to imagine energy sovereignty beyond fossil fuels. But what if we reverse the terms of this equation? Rather than think about how cinema helps us understand energy, what if, how might energy help us understand cinema? How might we extend Aguilar Gil's call for post-carbon energy production to reimagine the distribution and production of cinema for the 21st century? I think there's a lot to be gained by thinking about the structural ties between Mexican cinema and state oil revenue. While perhaps to a less comprehensive extent than countries like Venezuela or Nigeria, oil has really buoyed cultural production in Mexico. Ever since the industry was nationalized in 1938 in a radical gesture that took back control of subsoil resources from US oil companies and gave it back to the people of Mexico, hydrocarbons have bolstered national development. Pemex has essentially functioned until recently as the government's cash cow, steadily providing 40% of the federal government's operating revenue, right? So almost half of the operating revenue is sustained by oil, which makes the future of oil really important to the future of Mexico, as well as to the future of its cultural industries, right, which are often funded by the state and therefore also depend on oil revenue. So put differently, we can think about oil as an elemental media that mediates the shape and the scope of Mexican cultural industries, which is why I think it's so important to start to think about how we can delink these. Like other countries in Latin America and around the world, historically the Mexican film industry has been sustained by state funding. However, since the 80s, the private sector has gained a strong foothold. Today, only about half of all Mexican films receive some form of state support. The neoliberal shift of the film industry away from public funding was triggered by the 1982 debt crisis and cemented by the subsequent lost decade of economic depression. The 1982 debt crisis was catalyzed by plummeting global oil prices and demand. When the global price of oil dropped, the economy, which at that point was dependent at 70% on oil revenue, the economy went into a tailspin, and with it, so did state funding for cultural industries. So in the wake of the oil crisis, the Mexican film industry was radically transformed by austerity measures. Up until that point, as Ignacio Sanchez Prado has written in his study of this change, cinema in Mexico had been characterized by a sprawling state-centered infrastructure, sustained by a network of government-owned theaters, strict controls on ticket prices, mandated percentages of screen time for Mexican films, and vast subsidies for film production. This infrastructure reinforced a philosophy of cinema as a shared social and cultural experience that cut across demographic and geographic differences, a philosophy that changed as the industry underwent privatization. The deregulation of film admission prices, domestic distribution quotas, and exhibition management was later codified into law by NAFTA, which now, if you go to a movie theater in Mexico, 90% of the movies that you will see there are Hollywood productions, right? Which means that only about 10% are Mexican or domestic features. And the price of a movie ticket in Mexico is about 70% of a day's wage on minimum wage. So as a result, all of these changes have consolidated film watching, film going as sort of a middle to upper class experience. Sanchez Prado has shown how these changes also changed the content of Mexican cinema, which shifted then to appeal to urban upper middle class consumers who could afford to attend the movies. So one of the biggest consequences of this neoliberal transformation of cinema in the wake of the oil crisis has been the stratification of access. According to the Anuario Estadístico de Cine Mexicano, 88% of municipalities in Mexico do not have a movie theater, meaning that 40 million Mexicans are unable to easily access an exhibition space. This, of course, plays out across a rural-urban divide, with nearly a quarter of the nation's exhibition infrastructure located in Mexico City. But even within Mexico City, movie theaters tend to be concentrated in wealthier-centric areas, reflecting this reframing of film going as an activity for the middle and upper classes. In a recent assessment of this situation, the Research Commission of the Comunidad de Exhibición Cinematográfica described access as, quote, the most serious problem facing Mexican cinema, noting that most domestic film releases debut only in specialized theaters in upscale areas of Mexico City. So this context, of course, also shapes what I'm interested in Mexican eco-cinema, or cinema with environmentalist content. a genre that's exploded since 2010. Even though a lot of films about rural crisis or environmental crisis are being made, they're being made mostly by urban filmmakers, and they circulate then mostly among urban and wealthier publics. So it's important then to think about, we can think about the powerful representation that's performed by these films to raise awareness to the struggles of people who have been dispossessed or unimagined by the state. But the fact remains that rural people are largely unable to access exhibition spaces to see these films. Therefore, while eco-documentaries like these might be lauded for their ability to capture and communicate environmental crisis, thinking at the level of exhibition helps underscore how regimes of seeing are made possible for some and not for others. And this is a dynamic that Thema seeks to redress by directly distributing the film on YouTube. But of course, that also engages other issues like internet access. So cinema, therefore, is not just a modality of critique of the inequities that are structural to extractivist capital, it also retraces and reifies capital's spatialized logic of unequal exchange through its flows and its infrastructures of production and consumption. So the steep decline of exhibition spaces in rural Mexico and the increased availability of handheld devices inevitably leads to the question of whether streaming has solved or will solve the problem of access. Indeed, the expansion of information and communications technologies infrastructures throughout Mexico has made the contemporary cinematic experience increasingly digital, as we see with El Tema, which is distributed on YouTube, or the state-run streaming platform Film in Latino, where many art house films or eco-documentaries can be viewed for an affordable cost. Yet, telecommunications infrastructures are characterized by similar imbalances. Internet access in Mexico continues to operate along an urban-rural divide. Only 20% of homes in rural Mexico report internet connections, although 50% of rural inhabitants report internet access, which we could probably connect to they have a smartphone. What is worth underscoring here is that even content like El Tema, with its democratic distribution strategy on YouTube, continues to reach primarily publics that are other to the subjects who are depicted on screen. So what does the decline of movie theaters and the upswing in handheld devices mean for the film watching experience and its ecological footprint? In her panoramic assessment of exhibition in Mexico, Ana Rosas Mantecon is quick to point out that cinema has not always been a collective experience. Cinematic precursors like the magic lantern and the kinetoscope were designed for individualized bourgeois viewership. And yet the contemporary global shift in film distribution and exhibition away from the theater and towards streaming is not only a return to a more atomized or stratified viewing experience, it is also incomparably more carbon intensive. In their discussion of the high level of emissions associated with high-resolution streaming, Laura Marks and Radek Przalopolski posit that although streaming is often described as colonizing cinema in its facilitation of access to historically marginalized cinemas, in fact, the universalization of streaming can also be understood as a form of, quote, bandwidth imperialism, because of its prescriptive imposition of a resource-intensive model of cultural production and consumption that is ultimately unfeasible at a global scale. High-resolution streaming is premised on the fantasy of limitless capacity and the denial of data's material costs. Under current fossil fuel energy regimes, the expansion of high-resolution streaming is unfeasible without significant ecological costs. In 2019, streaming accounted for 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and researchers project that by 2030, streaming will be responsible for 7% of global emissions. Therefore, rather than uphold high-resolution streaming as the gold standard that should be adopted by everyone in the world, Marx proposes an inverse path charted by global South filmmakers who embrace low-resolution or small-file aesthetics. While this is perhaps a choice that's driven by necessity, it is a model that could be purposefully adopted by filmmakers throughout the world who are interested in aligning their work aesthetically and ethically with the precepts of growth, or the redistributive downscaling of production and consumption as a means to achieve environmental sustainability as well as social justice. The global trend towards streaming brings other contradictions into view. On the one hand, the expansion of affordable portable electronic devices has made filmmaking more democratic. The explosion of Latin American features and shorts dedicated to environmental issues can be linked to increased access to inexpensive filmmaking equipment, editing software, and other necessary resources, all of which has made it easier for historically marginalized filmmakers to bypass traditional funding structures and production routes that have favored well-educated urban white men. On the other hand, the expansion of low-cost electronic equipment with short lifespans is correlated to the exponential growth of electronic waste. The transnational dynamics of e-waste disposal reify entrenched colonial logics, tracing a trajectory that inversely mirrors the extraction of minerals from the global south, which is the condition of possibility for industries like Hollywood. Mexico, for example, is the primary global exporter of flat-screen TVs and the top importer of used or defunct electronics like smartphones from the United States. The informal disposal of e-waste in Mexico exposes industry laborers and their communities to harmful heavy metals, resulting in a slew of ills for human health and the environment. Therefore, to holistically consider the global rise of streaming and smartphones also entails acknowledging where these devices originate and where they end up, where they are shipped, sorted, resold, repurposed, deboned, smelted, and dumped. It is also to recognize the environmental effects of media not only as moving viewers to care about the environment through pathos, but as materially touching waste workers, informal recyclers, and their children through dangerous environmental byproducts. So in Mexico, both cinema and infrastructure have been conceptualized as tangible signs of modernity and development. As my abbreviated account thus far has shown, these two forms of production have frequently operated in tandem, with oil revenue bolstering cultural industries and cultural industries reinforcing the values of petroculture as co-equal to prosperity. The shrinking of exhibition infrastructure that has accompanied the waning of oil reserves underscores the contingent correlation of these two forms and the perils of national reliance on oil to sustain cultural production and other social programs. In Mexico, the acceleration of state investment in drilling and refining infrastructures, as well as exploratory fracking in the hope of reviving oil as the source of national revenue, at the same time that the state withdraws support from cultural infrastructure, signals the perpetuation of sort of this cycle. Untangling the knot of cinema and oil, to take one step further, El Tema's call to viewers to confront the inevitable exhaustion of oil and to come together around reimagining small-scale, community-led alternative forms of clean energy requires that we begin to imagine new forms of cultural and energy infrastructures that might bring a world beyond carbon into being, as well as a world that is more just or culturally just. I'm now going to turn to one such experiment, Cine Móvil Toto. Cine Móvil Toto is a nonprofit that seeks to address the lack of film distribution in rural Mexico and simultaneously decarbonize exhibition. It does so by bringing bike-powered open-air film screenings of Mexican movies to rural communities that lack movie theaters or streaming capabilities. Founded by Roberto Serrano and Diego Torres in 2013, Cine Móvil Toto really took off in 2019 when corporate sponsorships enabled them to scale up their efforts from 20 screenings a year to over 200. Their mission to bring Mexican cinema to rural populations was based on Torres' previous experience with El Cine en tu Comunidad, a now defunct Cine or state-funded ambulant exhibition program that similarly aimed to expand access to Mexican cinema. And their twist on this model was to power it with renewable energy. So Cine Móvil Toto works as follows. A van-based team conducts regional tours with pre-scheduled stops for screenings in towns and villages. When they arrive, in conjunction with local governments and community organizations, the Toto team determines the best space for the screening, which is typically a plaza or an open-air sports court, as we can see here, with enough room to project a film. And the outdoor nature of these venues has been a plus because they've continued to operate throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. The host community provides seating for the show in the form of benches or plastic chairs or folding chairs, And at the front of the audience, the Toto team sets up 4 stationary bicycles. And in advance of and during the show, community members, often children, pedal the bikes in order to power the exhibition equipment. The Toto team drums up viewers through publicity, as well as on the day of the event through announcements over a loudspeaker on their van, which they affectionately called the Totoneta. Armed with a catalog of films sponsored by InCine, the team gives a brief synopsis to the public of the available options. The public then votes on which film to screen, and often family-friendly films prevail, since Cine Mobile Toto tends to draw families and young people. Okay, so Cine Mobile Toto we can understand to be the latest iteration in a long tradition of Latin American ambulant theater, or ambulant cinema, which was first launched in Cuba in the 1960s. Samara Falikov explains that this model in Cuba was based on the Russian agitprop trains that toured Russia after the 1917 October Revolution, bringing actors and artists to rural Russians to disseminate communist policies and propaganda. In Cuba, Cines Móviles were similarly conceived as a crucial part of Fidel Castro's nation-building project. Films and projectors were transported to remote locations throughout Cuba by trucks, mules, and even fishing boats. You can see the mules carrying the film equipment in the top left photo there. To signal the Cuban Revolution's commitment to bringing modernity to rural regions, and as a means of communication with a historically disenfranchised population. The program was a success. It tripled the number of film viewers in Cuba within a decade. So, Cine Mobile Toto exemplifies how the ambulant cinema model has been refashioned and updated for the 21st century, when access to cinema endures as a central issue, but exhibition is no longer considered within the scope of the neoliberal state. If mobile cinemas have historically functioned as a means of spreading propaganda and consolidating sentiments of national belonging, Cine Mobile Toto carries on in this tradition. The state continues to underpin the initiative, from local governments that provide lodging and permit the use of public space to cooperation from InCine, which is the state-operated film industry arm, which facilitates the licensing of state-funded domestic films for distribution. By limiting the films that they offer to domestic cinema, Cine Mobile Toto justifies its alignment with InCine's goal of fomenting national cultural production, essentially operating as an arm of this entity by filling the space of cut programs. In this sense, Cine Mobile Toto is symptomatic of the privatization of cinema in Mexico, in that it is a private nonprofit that has stepped in to redress the state's abandonment of the distribution and exhibition of domestic cultural production. So in addition to state support, Cine Mobile Toto relies on corporate sponsorships to finance their tours. And this is how their website pitches potential corporate sponsors in a variety of ways that are recognizable as green capitalism. First is the appeal to a form of image branding or greenwashing. Quote, associate your brand with social responsibility as a friend to the environment. Quote, make your brand the face of the United Nations Sustainable Development Objectives. They also explain that sponsorship provides a way to amplify your brand visibility in these hard-to-reach areas, and how you can obtain market research through the team. Quote, on each tour, we can conduct activities like product sampling and demonstrations, as well as surveys of the audience in each community. So to illustrate how this works, let's look at a tour in 2021 that was sponsored by Grupo Modelo, Mexico's largest beer maker, Corona Modelo. Yeah. So as part of the sponsorship package, Toto screened a sponsored short about responsible drinking practices prior to the main feature, and they conducted a survey with adult attendees before and after they viewed the sponsored content to gauge brand favorability. These sorts of corporate sponsorships have allowed Toto to expand their scope and conduct multiple tours a year. But they also demonstrate how even these experiments in post-carbon cinema must continue to negotiate the realities of funding in the context of limited state support. Grupo Modelo's relatively small investment in funding the Toto team reaps the company various rewards, including increasing brand visibility and the opportunity to conduct focus groups with hard-to-reach publics. It's also a way for Grupo Modelo to sort of tout their green credentials. The sponsorship allows Grupo Modelo to self-fashion their image in a way that we might describe as green corporate nationalism or greenwashing. In terms of actual carbon reduction, of course, Grupo Modelo could make a much bigger impact by creating internal changes to their production model. They're making moves to do so by embracing wind power as of 2019, but they've been slower to address their breweries' elevated usage of public water in drought-stricken areas like Mazatlan and Mexicali. So in this context, we can understand Grupo Modelo's partnership with Cinema with Toto as illustrative of how green cultural initiatives buoy brand visibility in ways that can be understood as greenwashing or the superficial support for carbon reduction without structural change. And I bring this up to sort of say that I'm not trying to romanticize what Toto is doing or to suggest that they somehow exist outside of neoliberal dynamics in which the cultural infrastructures are financed by capital. So nonetheless, I still think it's an interesting experiment, and it's interesting to think about the way in which they sort of fashion this image of decarbonized exhibition. And you can see from their logo on the left that the bicycle is really at the center of Cine Móvil Toto's image. And it's at the center of their pitch about how to green expanded access to Mexican cinema, quote, through the simple but powerful pedaling of a bicycle. Their imagery also orbits around the bicycle. In the logo, the two O's of Toto are bike wheels that abstractly connect to a projection bulb through a looping yellow cord. This discursive and visual framing foregrounds the bicycle as Toto's central powering device. Yet manually operated bicycles can only generate so much energy. Essentially, the bikes only produce a certain amount of watts per hour, and that output really varies based on who's doing the biking, and often it's children because they're enjoying participating, but that really also limits how much energy the bikes are producing. So for this reason, they only use the bikes to power the audio console, speakers, the Blu-ray, and other equipment that does not require continuous high volume energy. The projector, by contrast, has higher energy demands and is powered by solar panels to ensure its seamless operation. These solar panels are strapped to the team van, where they charge during the trip, and then they're placed near the screening venue to continue to charge in advance of the show. The bicycle is an effective shorthand for fossil fuel alternatives nonetheless. A commonplace cheap technology, the widespread use of bicycles in rural communities proves that post-carbon modes of social organization already exist. To associate the bicycle with futurity and technological innovation, as Cine Móvil Toto does in its branding, scrambles the typical collapse of modernity with high carbon lifestyles or expensive green technologies that are nonetheless reliant on extractivist exploitation of minerals like lithium, an essential material for the batteries that are needed to power solar panels. The insights of Marxist philosopher Bolívar Echeverría help elucidate this point. Echeverría has argued that the idea of modernity has been so subsumed by capitalism and whiteness that these concepts appear coterminous. Yet modernity, Echeverría notes, demands to be reimagined beyond its contingent capitalist iteration, which promises abundance but undercuts this promise through its exploitative relations of production, both to labor and to nature. Modernity, Echeverría urges, should be conceptualized as the potential of technology to serve principles that stretch beyond accumulation, like collaboration and community. The bicycle is one such example of a technology that possesses this potential to reorient modernity beyond accumulation. And from this perspective, the widespread use of bicycles in rural communities is not an indicator of belated modernity, but a model of post-carbon living that articulates one path toward a planetary future. While Toto's visual and discursive focus on the bicycle reinforces its association with post-carbon technologies, The greater efficacy of solar panels at meeting the high volume energy requirements of film projection presents us with the question of why this technology is absent from their messaging. We might speculate that the bike is given greater weight than solar because pedal-powered machines invite community involvement in the production of green. Yet, to stress the audience's role in reducing emissions when solar power is what truly undergirds Toto's screenings reinforces the narrative that the responsibility to reduce emissions lies with the individual. This is misleading, of course, on various fronts. Mexico itself is only responsible for 1% of global emissions, and the low-income communities that Toto services produce just 1/7 of the emissions of their wealthier counterparts in Mexico. Therefore, while the centrality of bikes in allowing individuals to power exhibition infrastructures makes the energy demands of culture visible and corporeal, this visual shorthand also obscures the fact that the solutions to the energy crisis are collective and require large-scale systematic change, not individual interaction. So while cinema as an industry is far from a key emitter when compared to sectors like transportation and manufacturing, Cinema with Toto nonetheless illustrates how reimagining cultural infrastructure to prioritize access, equity, and climate can be put into action. This model, I think, it's imperfect, and it's just the jumping off point, I think, for some speculation of our own. How might rural communities not just be visited by outside initiatives like Toto, but also be equipped with the infrastructure to generate their own projects and exhibition spaces? Such a move would shift focus from the active involvement of rural participants in reducing their already insignificant energy consumption by pedaling and reorient it to providing communities with the technologies that will allow them to create their own post-carbon paths to cultural modernity. So in that sense, I think that Toto's green exhibition model might be brought into generative dialogue with efforts like Aquí Cine, which is a nonprofit network based in Oaxaca that supports community-led exhibition spaces. Founded in 2011 by Damian Lopez and Nina Maran as an itinerant film initiative serving rural communities in Oaxaca, in 2013, Aquí Cine morphed into something different, a platform to help rural cinephiles establish more permanent exhibition sites in their communities. In this iteration, Aquí Cine operates as a hub around which locally organized spokes gravitate. The initiative works in this way. Someone from a community that lacks an exhibition space contacts Aquí Cine, which helps them identify a place for an alternative exhibition site or cine club in their town. And then Aquí Cine provides them with guidance about how to arrange that space and how to get the equipment that they need. Once the site is established as part of its network, Aquí Cine offers free film programming obtained from festivals, distributors, and filmmakers, and they also provide workshops to train community organizers and support the longevity of each cine group. Through these efforts, Aquí Cine has enabled the formation of 17 exhibition initiatives in indigenous communities in Oaxaca, Zapotec, Mije, Mixtec, and Mazatec. So Aquí Cine's transition from an ambulant theater into a distribution exhibition infrastructure illustrates how the problem of access can be tackled in a way that is community-driven and self-sustaining. While the ephemeral nature of Cine Movilitoto is buoyed by the excitement of a transitory experience, the spokes supported by Aquí Cine build community over time around the shared space of the theater. As Fernanda Rio, one of the participants, eloquently puts it in her Manual para Exhibicionistas, Cómo Montar un Cine, or Manual for Exhibitors, How to Establish a Movie Theater, a guide based on her experience, quote, congregating in the darkness becomes an act of collusion, a shared situation that turns individuals into a mind that thinks as a collective, or a collective mind that construes cinema as a situation in common. So based on her observation, we might think that a future iteration of Cine Movilitoto might expand in this direction, helping rural communities establish decarbonized cinema infrastructure that will endure in time and serve the interests of the community as it sees fit. Although the green exhibition model deployed by Cine Mobilité was developed in response to scarcity, that is the absence of exhibition spaces, such a model would be most impactfully adopted not by those whose carbon footprint is already minuscule, but by those who have a disproportionate carbon footprint. For example, we here in the United States. We see this at work in an initiative like Solar World Cinema, which is a Dutch initiative that sort of emulates the Toto model. Which presents us with an opportunity about how these models in post-carbon cinema might be adopted by choice in urban centers, in the global north, and by film festivals. And my desire here is not to sort of have a call for austerity or for less culture, but rather how we might build film infrastructures that are plentiful in ways that So in conclusion, if one of cinema's promises is its ability to give ephemeral form to a shared space or a commons around which subjects can come into contact and possible relation, it is infrastructure that makes this coming together possible. From the structures of funding that finance film production to the physical space of movie theater. Infrastructure wields organizational force. The infrastructures of culture subtend the stories that are told, the ways that they're told, and the ways that they are consumed. Thinking about the infrastructures of distribution and exhibition helps reveal competing ideas about what content matters, what audiences are valuable, and how culture itself ought to work. By foregrounding exhibition as an object of study, Latin American film scholars and those of us who study environmentalist cinema can pose difficult questions like, what does it mean to make and consume films about people who cannot access them themselves? Or are handheld devices the only answer to this dilemma? How might we reimagine cinema spectatorship? Questions like these point to the importance of developing methods of scholarly inquiry that cultivate the connections between media about the environment and media in the environment. They also pump the brakes on analysis that romanticizes what cinema can accomplish without also grappling with its structural limitations, circumscribed as they are by long histories of colonial capitalism and reinforced in the present neoliberal cultural infrastructures. By the same token, infrastructure is a potent site for building alternative models of sociality that might enable the flourishing of the commons rather than its fragmentation, a commons that's collectively conceived, equitable, and durable in the long term. And I think examples like Cine Mobilité and Aquí Cine invite us to ask what cultural infrastructures built to sustain a world after oil might look like. Thank you.
Thank you.